Some people say that monsters hide under beds or lurk in dark closets, but I learned at the tender age of 12 that the most terrifying evil can share your breakfast table, call the same woman mother, and sleep just down the hallway from your bedroom. This is a truth I've carried like a stone in my chest for nearly 60 years, and today, at 71 years old, I'm finally ready to share it with you. My name is Margaret, though most folks call me Maggie, and I'm speaking to you from my little apartment here in Sunny Acres Retirement Community in Tampa, Florida, where the palm trees sway and the afternoon thunderstorms remind me that even the darkest clouds eventually pass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was born Margaret Rose Patterson in the autumn of 1954, in a small Ohio town called Millbrook where everybody knew everybody else's business, and secrets were harder to keep than snow in July. Our house sat on Maple Street, a modest two-story, with white clapboard siding that my mother Linda painted fresh every spring, as if a new coat of paint could somehow make our complicated family feel more normal. The front porch had a wooden swing where I spent countless hours reading library books and watching the neighborhood children play games I was too shy to join. My real father had died when I was just 3 years old, taken by a heart attack that struck him down in our very own driveway as he was washing his beloved Chevrolet on a Saturday morning. I have only scattered memories of him, the smell of his aftershave, the way he'd lift me high above his head until I squealed with laughter, and the rough texture of his work shirt when he'd hold me close during thunderstorms. After he passed, my mother Linda struggled terribly, working double shifts at the local diner while trying to raise me and keep our little house from falling into foreclosure. When I was 7, everything changed. My mother met Robert Hawkins at the Methodist Church's Wednesday night supper, and after a courtship that lasted barely 6 months, they married in a simple ceremony in our living room. Robert wasn't a bad man, I want to make that clear from the start. He was steady, reliable, and he genuinely loved my mother in his quiet, reserved way. He worked as a supervisor at the paper mill on the edge of town, bringing home a decent paycheck that meant we could finally stop worrying about whether the electricity would be turned off or if there'd be enough food for the whole week. But Robert came with baggage of his own. His son Tommy, who was 2 years older than me and had been living with his grandmother since his own mother had abandoned him when he was just a baby. Tommy was 9 when he came to live with us, all sharp elbows and defiant glares, carrying a battered suitcase and a chip on his shoulder the size of Lake Erie. He had sandy brown hair that never seemed to lay flat no matter how much Brylcreem Robert applied to it, and pale blue eyes that reminded me of winter ice, beautiful from a distance, but cold and dangerous up close. From the very first day Tommy moved into our house, I knew something wasn't right about him. While Robert and my mother were busy playing house and trying to blend our families together like ingredients in one of Linda's casseroles, Tommy was studying me with the intensity of a cat watching a mouse hole. He never said anything overtly threatening, never did anything my parents could point to as problematic, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn sour. Our house wasn't large, and space was at a premium once we became a family of 4. I had to give up my little bedroom under the eaves and share the larger back bedroom with my older sister Sarah, who had just turned 15 and was none too pleased about losing her privacy. Sarah was everything I wasn't: confident, popular at school, with golden blonde hair that caught the light like spun silk and a laugh that could fill a room. She'd been my protector since our father died, the one who checked under my bed for monsters and held my hand during scary movies, but now she was more interested in boys and makeup than in her awkward little stepsister. Tommy got what had been Sarah's room, a space that connected to the main hallway and gave him easy access to the rest of the house. Too easy, as I would later discover. The walls in our old house were thin, and at night I could hear him moving around, his footsteps creaking on the floorboards long after Robert and Linda had gone to sleep. Sometimes I'd wake up in the dark hours before dawn with the strangest feeling that someone had been watching me sleep, but when I'd peek through my barely opened eyes, there would be nothing there but shadows and the sound of my own heart hammering against my ribs. School became both my refuge and my torment. Tommy and I attended the same elementary school, though he was in 4th grade while I was still struggling through 2nd grade, having been held back a year after my father's death. When grief made it impossible for me to concentrate on reading and arithmetic. The teachers all knew our family situation and made well-meaning efforts to encourage Tommy and me to walk to school together, to look out for each other like proper siblings should. But Tommy made it clear from the beginning that he wanted nothing to do with me in public. At home, he might stare at me with those ice chip eyes, but at school he pretended I didn't exist, which was almost worse than outright cruelty. The other children in my class were kind enough, but I was painfully shy and found it difficult to make friends. I spent most of my recesses sitting alone under the big oak tree in the schoolyard, reading whatever book I'd managed to check out from the tiny school library. It was during one of these solitary lunch periods that I first noticed Tommy watching me from across the playground, his gaze so intense I could feel it like heat from a fire. When I looked up and caught his eye, he didn't look away or wave like a normal brother might. Instead, he smiled, and there was something in that smile that made me want to run all the way home and hide under my bed. At home, the dynamics were complex and often uncomfortable. Robert worked long hours at the mill, leaving early in the morning and not returning until after 6 in the evening, his clothes covered in paper dust and his face drawn with exhaustion. My mother continued working at the diner, though now it was just part-time since Robert's income meant she didn't have to carry the full financial burden alone. This meant that Sarah, Tommy, and I were often left to our own devices for hours after school, with Sarah supposedly in charge but more interested in talking on the phone with her friends than in supervising her younger siblings. It was during these unsupervised afternoon hours that Tommy began his campaign of psychological warfare against me. It started small. My favorite doll would disappear from my bed, only to turn up days later in the basement, dirty and missing an arm. The sandwich I'd carefully saved from lunch would vanish from the refrigerator. My homework assignments would go missing from my school bag, forcing me to stay after school to redo them while Tommy watched from across the classroom with that same cold smile. When I complained to Sarah about these incidents, she'd roll her eyes and tell me I was being a baby, that I probably just misplaced things because I was careless and scatterbrained. When I tried to tell my mother, she was usually too tired or too distracted by her new marriage to pay much attention. Children have to learn to work out their differences, she'd say, not looking up from whatever household task was consuming her attention. Tommy's had a hard life, honey. Try to be patient with him while he adjusts to being part of our family. But I knew, with the instinctive certainty that children sometimes possess, that this wasn't about adjustment or sibling rivalry. There was something darker at work, something that made my stomach clench with dread whenever I heard Tommy's footsteps on the stairs or found him standing in a doorway watching me with those pale, calculating eyes. The turning point came on a gray February afternoon when I was home alone with Tommy. Sarah had stayed after school for cheerleading practice, Robert was working a double shift at the mill, and my mother was covering an extra shift at the diner for a coworker who'd called in sick. The house felt different when it was just the two of us, charged with a tension that made the air itself seem thick and difficult to breathe. I was sitting at the kitchen table working on a spelling assignment when Tommy appeared in the doorway, holding a glass of what looked like chocolate milk. He rarely spoke to me directly, so when he offered me the drink with an almost friendly smile, every instinct I possessed screamed that something was wrong. But I was 12 years old, raised to be polite and obedient, and when he insisted that he'd made it special just for me, I couldn't figure out how to refuse without seeming ungrateful. The chocolate milk tasted strange, bitter underneath the sweetness, with a metallic aftertaste that made me wrinkle my nose. When I mentioned this to Tommy, he just shrugged and said that Linda had bought a different brand of chocolate syrup, that I'd get used to it if I finished the whole glass. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Something in his tone, a barely concealed eagerness, made me want to push the glass away, but he stood there watching me with such intensity that I felt compelled to keep drinking until every last drop was gone. Within an hour, I knew something was terribly wrong. The room began to spin around me like a carnival ride, and my stomach churned with a nausea so violent I could barely stand upright. My hands started shaking uncontrollably, and when I tried to call for help, my voice came out as barely a whisper. Tommy watched all of this with what I can only describe as scientific interest, as if I were a laboratory rat and he was taking notes on his experiment. When I finally collapsed on the kitchen floor, my vision blurring and my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst from my chest, Tommy knelt down beside me with that same cold smile I'd grown to fear. "You don't look so good, little sister," he said, his voice soft and almost caring if you didn't know to listen for the cruelty underneath. "Maybe you should go lie down. I'll take real good care of you." What followed were the longest, most terrifying hours of my young life. Tommy half carried, half dragged me up to the bedroom I shared with Sarah, and for a moment I thought he was actually going to help me, that maybe I'd misjudged him and he really was concerned about my condition. But once he had me alone in that room, with the door closed and the rest of the house empty, his true nature finally revealed itself completely. I was too weak to fight back, too sick to scream for help that wouldn't come anyway. The poison, because I know now that's what it was, though I never learned exactly what he'd put in that chocolate milk, had left me as helpless as a newborn kitten. I could barely move, could barely speak, could barely think through the fog of nausea and terror that consumed me. And Tommy took advantage of every moment of my vulnerability, finding ways to hurt me that wouldn't leave obvious marks, whispering threats and promises that made me wish I could just disappear entirely. He told me that if I ever said anything to anyone about what happened, he'd make sure the poison was stronger next time, that he'd make sure I didn't survive to tell tales. He described in vivid detail all the ways he could hurt me, hurt Sarah, hurt my mother, and make it look like accidents. He was only 11 years old, but he spoke with the cold calculation of someone much older, someone who had thought through every possible scenario and planned for every contingency. Time moved strangely during those hours. Sometimes it felt like minutes were stretching into eternities, and sometimes whole chunks of time seemed to disappear entirely, leaving me with only fragments of memory, Tommy's face hovering over mine. The sound of his breathing, the weight of his hand over my mouth when I tried to whimper. I drifted in and out of consciousness, never sure if what I was experiencing was real or some kind of poison-induced nightmare. By the time Sarah came home from cheerleading practice, I was burning with fever and shaking so violently that my teeth chattered loud enough to hear from the hallway. Tommy had returned to his own room, and when Sarah found me curled up on my bed, he came running as if he'd heard her concerned cries and was worried about his poor sick stepsister. He even suggested that they should call our mother at the diner, that maybe I needed to go to the hospital. But when Sarah reached for the phone, Tommy stopped her with a hand on her arm. "You know how upset Mom gets about medical bills," he said, his voice full of false concern. "And it's probably just a stomach bug. Kids get them all the time. Why don't we wait and see if she feels better in the morning? If she's still sick tomorrow, then we can call." Sarah, who was only 15 and frightened by my condition but also mindful of the family's precarious finances, agreed to wait. She brought me cool washcloths for my forehead and sat beside my bed reading to me from one of my favorite books, but as the night wore on and my condition didn't improve, I could see the worry growing in her eyes. I wanted desperately to tell her what had really happened, to warn her about Tommy and beg her to get me away from him, but every time I tried to speak, the words got tangled up in my throat. Whether it was the effects of whatever he'd given me or pure terror, I couldn't seem to form the sentences I needed to save myself. All I could do was lie there, sweating and shaking and praying that I'd live through the night. Tommy came to check on me several times after Sarah fell asleep in the chair beside my bed. Each time, he'd lean down close to my ear and whisper reminders of what would happen if I told anyone the truth. His breath was hot against my skin, and the smell of him, soap and something else, something sour and dangerous, made my already churning stomach lurch with fresh nausea. "This is our secret," he'd whisper. "And if you're smart, you'll keep it that way. Because next time, I might not be so generous. Next time, you might not wake up at all." The fever broke sometime near dawn, leaving me weak and hollow but finally able to think clearly again. Sarah had dozed off in her chair, her neck bent at an uncomfortable angle, and the house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of early morning, birds chirping outside the window, the furnace clicking on in the basement, the distant rumble of the milk truck making its rounds through the neighborhood. I lay there in my sweat-soaked sheets, staring at the water stains on the ceiling and trying to process what had happened to me. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a fever dream, a nightmare brought on by whatever stomach bug or flu I'd caught. But deep down, I knew the truth. Tommy had tried to hurt me in the worst possible way, had taken advantage of my helplessness to inflict pain and terror that went far beyond anything a normal sibling rivalry could explain. When my mother finally came home from her shift at the diner that morning, she was immediately concerned about my condition. She felt my forehead, checked my pulse, and announced that if I wasn't better by noon, she was taking me to see Dr. Hendricks. Regardless of what it cost. But by then, whatever Tommy had given me was working its way out of my system, and though I was still weak and shaky, the immediate danger seemed to have passed. "It must have been one of those 24-hour bugs," my mother said, smoothing my hair back from my forehead with a cool hand. "You scared your sister half to death, sweetheart. She said you were burning up with fever and talking out of your head." Tommy, who had been lurking in the doorway listening to this conversation, stepped forward with an expression of perfect brotherly concern. "I wanted to call you last night," he said, his voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. "But Sarah thought we should wait and see if Maggie felt better in the morning. I was so worried about her." My mother smiled at him with such warmth and gratitude that I felt my heart break a little more. "You're such a good brother, Tommy. I'm so glad you and Maggie are looking out for each other." Looking out for each other. If only she knew how far from the truth that was. If only I could find the words to tell her what had really happened, what kind of monster she'd welcomed into our home. But Tommy was watching me with those ice blue eyes, and I could read the promise there as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. "Keep quiet, or next time will be worse." So I kept quiet. I smiled weakly and accepted my mother's concern and care, let her bring me soup and ginger ale and fuss over me like the loving parent she was. But all the while, I was planning and thinking and trying to figure out how to protect myself from the predator who lived just down the hall. In the days that followed, I became a different child entirely. The shy, trusting girl who had shared a house with Tommy was gone, replaced by someone hypervigilant and suspicious, someone who checked and double-checked everything she ate or drank, someone who never let her guard down for even a moment when he was around. I started keeping a butter knife under my pillow, not because I thought it would be much protection against someone older and stronger, but because the weight of it there made me feel slightly less helpless. At school, I found it impossible to concentrate on my lessons. My grades, which had never been stellar to begin with, began to slip even further as I spent my days exhausted from sleepless nights and consumed with worry about what might be waiting for me when I got home. My teacher, Mrs. Robinson, kept me after class one afternoon to ask if everything was all right at home, if there was anything I wanted to talk about. For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. Mrs. Robinson was kind and patient, the sort of adult who actually listened when children spoke. But Tommy walked past the classroom window just as she was asking her questions, and when he saw me talking to the teacher, his expression made it clear that there would be consequences if I said the wrong thing. "Everything's fine," I told Mrs. Robinson, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've just been feeling a little sick lately. Stomach problems." She accepted this explanation, though I could see in her eyes that she wasn't entirely convinced. Looking back now, I wonder what might have changed if I'd found the courage to tell her the truth that day. But I was 12 years old and terrified. And the adult world seemed so far away and unreachable that keeping silent felt like my only option. The weeks that followed my poisoning were like living in a house made of glass, where every movement felt dangerous and every sound made me jump. Tommy had tasted power over me, and like a predator who discovers easy prey, he began to circle closer and closer, testing my boundaries and looking for new opportunities to strike. Spring arrived early that year in Millbrook, bringing with it the kind of warm, hopeful weather that should have lifted everyone's spirits. The daffodils pushed through the last patches of snow in our front yard, and the maple tree outside my bedroom window began to bud with tiny green leaves that caught the morning light like jewels. But for me, the changing season only meant longer days alone with Tommy, more hours when Sarah stayed after school for various activities and our parents were occupied with their work. My mother had noticed my increased quietness and attributed it to the lingering effects of what she still believed had been a severe stomach virus. She'd taken to packing extra snacks in my school lunch and making me special dinners designed to build my strength back up, never suspecting that her kindness was actually putting me in more danger. Every meal became a potential weapon in Tommy's hands, every glass of milk or juice a possible vehicle for whatever poison he might choose to use next time. I developed elaborate rituals around eating and drinking that probably seemed like childish quirks to the adults in my life. I would only drink water directly from the tap, never from glasses that had been sitting out. I insisted on making my own breakfast every morning, claiming I was trying to become more independent and helpful around the house. When my mother packed my school lunches, I would secretly dispose of anything that could have been tampered with and go hungry rather than risk another encounter with Tommy's chemical experiments. The weight loss was gradual but noticeable. By April, my clothes hung loose on my small frame, and the dark circles under my eyes had become a permanent feature. Dr. Hendricks, during a routine checkup that my mother had insisted on, commented that I seemed undernourished and perhaps needed vitamins to help with my recovery. He prescribed a bottle of iron pills that were supposed to help with my energy levels, but I was too afraid to take them, terrified that Tommy might find a way to contaminate even those. It was during this time that I began to understand the true genius of Tommy's cruelty. He had chosen a method of torment that was almost impossible to prove or explain. If I tried to tell anyone that my stepbrother was poisoning me, who would believe such an outlandish story? A 9-year-old boy deliberately making his younger stepsister sick? It sounded like the paranoid fantasy of a troubled child, especially when Tommy played his part so perfectly, continuing to act like the concerned older brother whenever adults were watching. He had also calculated correctly that the fear of repeat incidents would be almost as effective as the actual poisoning itself. I was so terrified of eating or drinking anything he might have touched that I was essentially starving myself, doing his work for him without him having to lift a finger. The psychological torture was perhaps even more devastating than the physical effects of whatever substance he'd given me that February afternoon. Sarah, bless her heart, tried to help in the way that teenage girls do when they notice something wrong but don't quite understand what it is. She started bringing me little treats from the 5-and-dime store downtown, candy bars and bags of chips that she would hand to me directly, still sealed in their original packaging. She probably thought she was just being nice to her little sister who'd been sick, but those sealed treats became some of the only food I felt safe eating during those dark weeks. One afternoon in late April, Sarah sat down on my bed while I was pretending to do homework and really just staring blankly at my spelling workbook. She had that serious expression she got when she was trying to be the responsible older sister our mother needed her to be. "Maggie, I'm worried about you," she said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair away from my face. You've been so quiet lately, and you're getting so thin. Are you still feeling sick from that bug you had? Maybe we should ask Mom to take you back to see Dr. Hendricks. I wanted so desperately to tell her everything. Sarah was only 3 years older than me, but she seemed infinitely more mature and capable. She was the kind of person who could take charge in a crisis, who could make adults listen when she had something important to say. If anyone could help me figure out how to deal with Tommy, it would be her. But even as I opened my mouth to try to explain, I could hear Tommy's footsteps in the hallway outside our room. He had developed an uncanny ability to appear whenever Sarah and I were having any kind of private conversation, as if he could sense from anywhere in the house when I might be on the verge of revealing his secrets. "I'm fine," I whispered, my eyes fixed on the bedroom door. "Just still getting my strength back, I guess." Sarah followed my gaze and frowned when she saw Tommy standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his hands in his pockets. And that familiar cold smile playing around the corners of his mouth. "Hey there, girls," he said in that false friendly tone he used when he wanted to sound like a normal kid. "What are you talking about? Anything interesting?" "Just sister stuff," Sarah replied, but I could hear a note of suspicion creeping into her voice. Maybe she was finally starting to notice that Tommy had a habit of interrupting our private moments. Maybe she was beginning to sense that something wasn't quite right about our new family dynamic. "Sister stuff, huh?" Tommy pushed himself away from the doorframe and took a step into the room. "Well, I'm part of this family too now. We shouldn't keep secrets from each other, should we, Maggie?" The way he said my name made my skin crawl, and I had to grip the edges of my spelling workbook to keep my hands from shaking visibly. Sarah glanced between Tommy and me, and I could see her trying to puzzle out the strange tension that seemed to fill the room whenever the three of us were together. "Some things are private," Sarah said finally, standing up from my bed and moving slightly so that she was positioned between Tommy and me. It was a subtle movement, probably unconscious, but it spoke to some protective instinct that she was beginning to develop even if she didn't fully understand why. Tommy's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "Of course they are. I wouldn't want to intrude on private sister conversations. I just want to make sure everyone in this family feels included and cared for." He lingered in the doorway for a few more moments, his gaze moving slowly from Sarah to me and back again, as if he was memorizing the scene for later reference. Then, with a casual shrug, he turned and walked away, leaving behind an atmosphere so charged with unspoken tension that neither Sarah nor I spoke for several minutes after his footsteps faded down the hallway. "He's weird," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time I'd heard anyone in our family acknowledge that there was something off about Tommy, and the relief I felt was so intense it almost brought tears to my eyes. But before I could respond, before I could try to explain just how weird and dangerous he really was, we heard the front door slam and our mother's voice calling out that she was home from work. The moment was lost, and with it, perhaps my best chance to find an ally in my own family. Sarah hurried downstairs to help with dinner preparations, and I was left alone with my spelling workbook and the growing certainty that I was truly on my own in this house of horrors. May brought with it the kind of oppressive heat that sometimes settles over the Midwest like a heavy blanket, making everyone irritable and short-tempered. Our old house didn't have air conditioning, just a few electric fans that did little more than move the hot air around, and tempers began to fray as the temperature climbed into the 90s day after day. It was during one of these sweltering afternoons that Tommy made his next move. Sarah had gone to spend the day at a friend's house, taking advantage of their family's new window air conditioning unit, and our parents were both at work. I had been hiding in the basement, where the concrete walls kept the temperature slightly more bearable, reading one of the Nancy Drew mysteries I'd checked out from the library. I heard his footsteps on the basement stairs before I saw him, and immediately my body went into high alert. There was nowhere to run in the basement, no back door or convenient hiding place. I was trapped in the cool, dim space with nothing but a few old furniture pieces and boxes of Christmas decorations between me and whatever Tommy had planned. "There you are," he said as he reached the bottom of the stairs, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "I've been looking all over for you, little sister." He was carrying something in his hand, but the basement lighting was too dim for me to make out what it was. My Nancy Drew book slipped from my fingers and hit the concrete floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "I brought you something special," Tommy continued, moving closer with that predatory gait that reminded me of a cat stalking a mouse. "Something to help you cool off on this hot day." As he got closer, I could see that he was holding a glass of what looked like lemonade, condensation beating on the outside of the glass in the humid air. My mouth was actually dry from the heat, and under normal circumstances, a cold drink would have been exactly what I needed. But nothing about these circumstances was normal, and every instinct I possessed screamed at me to get away from whatever was in that glass. "I'm not thirsty," I managed to say, my voice coming out as a croak. Tommy's smile widened. Now, that's not very nice, is it? I went to all the trouble of making this special lemonade just for you, and you won't even try it? That hurts my feelings, Maggie. He was close enough now that I could smell the sweet scent of the lemonade, could see the way the ice cubes clinked gently against the glass as his hand trembled slightly with excitement or anticipation. There was something else in his expression. Something hungry and expectant that made my stomach turn with familiar dread. Please, I whispered, pressing myself back against the concrete wall. I don't want any. But you look so hot and uncomfortable down here, Tommy said, his voice taking on that false, syrupy concern that I'd learned to fear more than outright threats. And this will make you feel so much better. Just like last time. Just like last time. The words hit me like a physical blow, confirming what I'd suspected all along. The February incident hadn't been a one-time thing, a momentary lapse in judgment or a childish prank gone wrong. Tommy had planned it carefully, had enjoyed watching me suffer, and now he was ready to do it again. What did you put in it? I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Tommy's eyes lit up with what looked like genuine pleasure at my question. Oh, you're getting smarter, aren't you? That's good, Maggie. I like it when you understand what's happening. It makes the game more interesting. Game. He called it a game, as if my terror and pain were nothing more than entertainment for him. The casual cruelty of it, the complete absence of any normal human empathy, was more frightening than any specific threat he could have made. I'm not playing any games with you, I said, trying to edge along the wall toward the stairs. But Tommy anticipated my movement and shifted to block my path, the glass of lemonade still extended toward me like a toxic offering. Oh, but you are playing, whether you want to or not. We're both playing, and I make the rules. The rules are very simple, you drink what I give you, and I decide what happens next. The basement suddenly felt even smaller and more claustrophobic than before. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows that made Tommy's face look demonic, and the familiar smell of concrete and old wood took on a sinister quality that made me feel nauseated. If you don't drink it willingly, Tommy continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, I'll have to find other ways to make sure you get your medicine. And those ways might be much less pleasant for both of us. I understood the threat implicitly. He was bigger than me, stronger than me, and we were alone in a soundproof basement where no one would hear if I screamed. He could force the liquid down my throat if he wanted to, and we both knew it. But something in me had changed since that February afternoon. The weeks of fear and vigilance had made me harder, more desperate, and desperation can sometimes give even the smallest person a kind of strength they didn't know they possessed. Instead of reaching for the glass, I suddenly lunged sideways toward the workbench where Robert kept his tools. My hand closed around the handle of a heavy wrench, and before Tommy could react, I was brandishing it like a weapon, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Stay away from me, I said, my voice shaking but determined. I'll hit you with this if you come any closer. For the first time since I'd known him, Tommy looked genuinely surprised. His confident smile faltered, and he took a half step backward, the glass of lemonade wavering in his hand. Now, Maggie, he said, his tone becoming placating, there's no need for violence. I'm just trying to be nice to you. Nice? The word came out as a harsh laugh. You call poisoning me nice? You call threatening me nice? I never, Tommy started to say, but I cut him off. Yes, you did. You put something in my chocolate milk that made me sick, and now you want to do it again. I know what you are, Tommy. You're not my brother, and you're not nice. You're just mean and cruel and I hate you. The words seemed to hang in the air between us, and for a moment, the only sound was the hum of the old furnace in the corner and the distant rumble of traffic on the street above. Tommy's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, anger, and finally something that looked almost like respect. Well, he said slowly, setting the glass of lemonade down on a nearby box, it looks like my little sister is finally growing some claws. That's interesting. He didn't try to come closer, but he didn't leave either. Instead, he stood there studying me with that calculating look I'd learned to dread, as if he was reassessing his strategy now that I'd shown I was willing to fight back. You can't carry that wrench around with you forever, he said finally. And you can't tell anyone about our little disagreement without sounding crazy. Who's going to believe that I'm trying to poison you? I'm just a kid, just like you. He was right, and we both knew it. Even if I told someone about this confrontation, how could I prove that there was anything dangerous in the lemonade he'd brought me? By the time any adult came to investigate, he could easily dispose of the evidence and claim that I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd threatened him with a weapon for no reason. But I'll make you a deal, Tommy continued, his voice taking on a businesslike tone that was somehow even more chilling than his previous threats. You can keep playing the tough girl, carrying weapons, and trying to avoid me. We can keep escalating this little conflict until someone gets seriously hurt. Or you can be smart about the situation. What do you mean? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear his answer. I mean, you can accept that things have changed in this family. That I'm in charge now, and you need to do what I say. If you're cooperative, if you don't cause problems or try to tell tales, then maybe I won't need to be quite so creative with my methods of keeping you in line. The offer was clearly meant to sound reasonable, like a negotiation between equals. But I could hear the underlying threat, could see the predatory gleam in his eyes that told me no amount of cooperation would ever be enough for someone like Tommy. He would always want more, would always find new ways to assert his dominance and feed whatever dark hunger drove him to hurt others. I'll never cooperate with you, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. And I'll never stop trying to get away from you. Tommy nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the answer he'd expected. Then we understand each other perfectly. This is war, little sister. And in war, there are always casualties. He turned and walked up the basement stairs without another word, leaving the glass of lemonade sitting on the box like a toxic monument to our confrontation. I stayed where I was for a long time after his footsteps faded, clutching the wrench and trying to process what had just happened. For the first time since Tommy had joined our family, I had stood up to him directly. I had refused to be a passive victim and had shown him that I was capable of fighting back. But instead of feeling victorious, I felt terrified. Because now he knew that I understood exactly what kind of monster he was, and he had made it clear that the gloves were coming off. The war he had declared would not be fought with conventional weapons or according to any rules that adults would recognize. It would be a shadow conflict, fought in the spaces between normal family life, using methods designed to destroy me slowly and invisibly. And I was 12 years old, armed with nothing but determination and a growing understanding that no one was coming to save me. That night, I lay in my bed listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling and trying to plan my next move. Sarah slept peacefully in the bed across from mine, unaware that her little sister was now engaged in a battle for survival with the boy our parents believed was a harmless addition to our family. I thought about the glass of lemonade still sitting in the basement, probably still cold, still carrying whatever poison Tommy had mixed into it. Tomorrow, our mother would probably find it and assume someone had just forgotten their drink. She would pour it down the sink and wash the glass, never knowing how close her daughter had come to being hurt again. The weight of this secret, this knowledge that I carried alone, felt heavier than the wrench I had wielded in the basement. But it was also my weapon now, my understanding of Tommy's true nature and methods. He might be older and stronger and more cunning than me, but he had made one crucial mistake: he had underestimated my ability to learn and adapt. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I was already beginning to formulate plans. If this was war, as Tommy had said, then I would have to become a soldier. I would have to learn to think like him, to anticipate his moves, to protect myself in ways that no 12-year-old should ever have to learn. The innocent little girl who had welcomed a new stepbrother into her home was gone forever, replaced by someone harder and more watchful. Someone who understood that monsters don't always hide under beds or in dark closets. Sometimes they sit at your breakfast table and call your mother Mom and smile at you with eyes like winter ice. The next few weeks became a careful dance of avoidance and vigilance. I developed new routines designed to minimize my alone time with Tommy, staying after school for any activity that would delay my return home, volunteering to help our neighbors with chores that would keep me out of the house, even feigning sudden illnesses that required me to spend time at the library or other public places where Tommy couldn't reach me. But I was fighting a losing battle, and deep down, I knew it. Tommy lived in the same house I did, shared the same family space, and had legitimate reasons to be anywhere I might try to hide. More troubling still, he seemed to be enjoying the challenge of my resistance, approaching our conflict with the methodical patience of someone who knew he held all the advantages. The summer of 1967 arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it temperatures that seemed to bake the very sidewalks of Millbrook and a humidity so thick you could almost swim through it. But the oppressive heat was nothing compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside our house on Maple Street, where Tommy and I continued our silent war while our parents remained blissfully unaware of the battle being fought right under their noses. My confrontation with Tommy in the basement had changed something fundamental between us. Where before he had been confident in his ability to terrorize me with impunity, now he seemed to approach our interactions with a new wariness, like a predator who had discovered that his intended prey had developed unexpected defenses. But this didn't make him less dangerous; if anything, it made him more creative in his cruelty. The glass of poisoned lemonade disappeared from the basement sometime during the night after our confrontation, and with it any evidence that might have supported my claims if I'd been brave enough to tell someone what had happened. Tommy was nothing if not careful about covering his tracks, and I began to understand that this level of calculation in someone so young was perhaps more frightening than random acts of violence would have been. School ended for the summer in early June, which meant long, empty days stretching ahead with nowhere to hide from Tommy's presence. Sarah had gotten a job at the local 5-and-dime store, working Monday through Friday and some Saturdays, which left me alone with my tormentor for hours at a time. My mother continued her shifts at the diner, picking up extra hours during the busy summer season when tourists passed through our town on their way to the lake resorts further north. Robert maintained his grueling schedule at the paper mill, coming home each evening covered in white dust and too tired to notice the subtle changes in his family dynamic. It was during one of these endless July afternoons that Tommy unveiled his newest strategy for terrorizing me. Instead of trying to physically harm me with poisons or other substances, he began a campaign of psychological warfare that was perhaps even more devastating than his previous attempts. I was sitting on the front porch trying to catch any breeze that might stir in the stifling air, reading a book I'd borrowed from Sarah's collection, when Tommy appeared with a small cardboard box in his hands. His expression was almost pleasant, which immediately put me on high alert since I'd learned that Tommy was never more dangerous than when he was pretending to be friendly. "Hey, Maggie," he said, settling himself on the porch steps just close enough to make me uncomfortable but not so close that I could claim he was threatening me. "I found something really interesting in the basement today. Want to see?" Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get up and walk away, but curiosity and a growing need to understand what I was dealing with kept me frozen in place. Tommy opened the cardboard box with an almost reverent care, and I caught a glimpse of something small and brown moving inside. "It's a mouse," he said, reaching into the box and pulling out a tiny field mouse by its tail. The poor creature was clearly terrified, its little body trembling as it hung helplessly from Tommy's grip. "I caught it this morning with one of Robert's traps from the basement." I felt sick watching the mouse's obvious distress, but something in Tommy's tone warned me that this was leading somewhere much darker than a simple show and tell about pest control. "The thing about mice," Tommy continued, his voice taking on that lecturing quality that made my skin crawl, "is that they're completely helpless once you catch them. They can't fight back, can't call for help, can't do anything except wait to see what happens to them." He was looking directly at me as he spoke, and I understood with horrible clarity that he wasn't really talking about the mouse at all. This was a demonstration, a lesson designed specifically for my benefit. "Now, I could just kill it quickly," Tommy said, still holding the mouse by its tail. "That would be the humane thing to do, wouldn't it? But where's the fun in that? There are so many more interesting possibilities." What happened next was something I've tried for decades to block from my memory, but certain images burn themselves into your mind so deeply that no amount of time or therapy can completely erase them. Tommy spent the next 20 minutes systematically torturing that small, defenseless creature while I sat frozen on the porch, unable to look away and unable to intervene. He didn't kill the mouse quickly or mercifully. Instead, he found ways to hurt it that would prolong its suffering, all while maintaining that same calm, almost scientific demeanor that was somehow more terrifying than any display of obvious sadism would have been. And throughout the entire ordeal, he kept up a running commentary clearly designed to let me know that I was seeing a preview of what he was capable of doing to anything or anyone that was helpless and vulnerable. "The important thing," he said as the mouse's struggles grew weaker, "is to make sure they understand that you're in complete control. That there's no escape, no rescue coming, no hope of things getting better. Once they accept that reality, you can do whatever you want with them." When the mouse finally died, Tommy disposed of its tiny body with the same casual indifference he might have shown throwing away a piece of trash. Then he turned to me with that cold smile I'd come to know so well and said, "Wasn't that educational, little sister? I think we both learned something important today." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. The casual cruelty I'd just witnessed, combined with the obvious message it was meant to convey, left me feeling more hopeless and terrified than I'd ever felt in my life. Tommy had shown me exactly what kind of monster he was, and he'd made it clear that I was just as helpless as that poor mouse had been. After Tommy went back into the house, I sat on that porch for hours, staring at the spot where the mouse had died and trying to process what I'd just experienced. I understood. Now that I wasn't dealing with a normal child who was acting out or struggling with the adjustment to a new family. I was living with someone who derived genuine pleasure from causing pain and suffering, someone who was methodically working to break down my resistance and establish complete dominance over me. That night, I lay in my bed listening to Sarah's peaceful breathing and wondering how much longer I could survive in this environment. The physical threats had been terrifying enough, but this new psychological assault felt like it might be more than I could endure. Tommy had found a way to torture me without laying a finger on me, without doing anything that our parents could point to as obviously wrong. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. Tommy would find small animals, mice, birds that had fallen from their nests, insects, anything helpless and vulnerable, and would subject them to prolonged suffering while making sure I was there to witness it. Each time, he would maintain that same calm, educational tone, explaining what he was doing and why, making it clear that these demonstrations were meant to teach me about my own position in his twisted worldview. I began having nightmares so vivid and terrible that I was afraid to fall asleep. I would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening for any sound that might indicate Tommy was moving around the house. My appetite disappeared completely, and the weight loss that had begun after the poisoning incident accelerated to the point where my clothes hung on me like they belonged to someone much larger. Sarah noticed the changes in me, of course. How could she not? But when she tried to talk to me about what was wrong, I found myself unable to explain what was happening. How could I tell her that our stepbrother was torturing small animals as a way of threatening me? How could I describe the psychological warfare he was waging without sounding like I was having some kind of breakdown? "Maggie, you're scaring me," Sarah said one evening as we were getting ready for bed. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks, and you're so thin I can see your ribs. Please tell me what's going on." I wanted so desperately to confide in her, to share the burden of this terrible secret that was eating me alive from the inside. But every time I opened my mouth to try to explain, I could hear Tommy's voice in my head, describing all the ways he could hurt not just me but anyone I cared about. "I'm fine," I whispered, the lie tasting like ashes in my mouth. "Just having trouble sleeping in this heat." Sarah didn't believe me, I could see it in her eyes, but she didn't push the issue. Maybe she thought I was going through some kind of phase, or maybe she was too caught up in her own teenage concerns to fully grasp the severity of what was happening. Either way, I remained trapped in my silent nightmare with no one to turn to for help. It was in early August that Tommy escalated his campaign in a way that nearly broke me completely. I was in the kitchen making myself a peanut butter sandwich, one of the few foods I still felt safe eating since I could prepare it myself and watch it the entire time, when he appeared in the doorway with something cupped in his hands. "Look what I found," he said, his voice filled with false excitement. "A baby bird that fell out of its nest in the backyard. The poor little thing is hurt." I looked down at his hands and saw a tiny sparrow, barely feathered, cheeping weakly as it tried to move. It was clearly injured, probably from the fall, and my first instinct was to try to help it somehow. Maybe we could take it to the veterinarian, or at least make it comfortable while it healed. But the expression on Tommy's face told me that healing was the last thing on his mind. He had that same hungry, anticipatory look I'd learned to associate with his cruelest moments, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized what was about to happen. "We should help it," I said quickly, hoping against hope that I might be able to intervene this time. Maybe Dr. Morrison would look at it if we took it to his office. Tommy's smile widened. "Oh, I'm going to help it all right. I'm going to put it out of its misery. But first, I think we should take a closer look at how fragile these little creatures really are." What followed was another session of systematic torture, more prolonged and sadistic than anything I'd witnessed before. Tommy seemed to take special pleasure in the fact that this creature was a baby, completely helpless and dependent on others for its survival. He drew out its suffering for what felt like hours, all while maintaining that same calm, instructional tone that made the whole ordeal even more horrifying. But this time was different. This time, something in me finally snapped. "Stop it!" I screamed, lunging forward to try to grab the bird away from him. "Just stop it. You're a monster. You're sick and evil and I hate you." Tommy easily avoided my clumsy attempt to rescue the bird, but my outburst seemed to genuinely surprise him. For a moment, his mask of calm control slipped, and I saw something raw and ugly underneath: rage at being defied, fury at having his carefully orchestrated demonstration interrupted. "Shut up!" he hissed, grabbing my wrist with his free hand and squeezing until I gasped with pain. "Shut up right now, or I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your short life." But I was beyond caring about his threats. Something had finally broken inside me, and all the fear and rage and helplessness I'd been carrying for months came pouring out in a torrent of words. "I'll tell everyone what you are," I shouted, not caring if the neighbors heard, not caring if our parents came running. "I'll tell them about the poison and the animals and all of it. I'll make them see what you really are." Tommy's grip on my wrist tightened until I was sure he was going to break it, but his voice remained eerily calm. "No, you won't. Because if you do, I'll tell them about how you've been lying and making up stories to get attention. I'll tell them how you threatened me with a weapon in the basement, how you've been acting crazy and unstable since your real father died. And when they realize you can't be trusted, when they see that you're just a disturbed little girl who needs to be locked away somewhere safe, I'll have all the time in the world to visit you and continue our education sessions." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that it cut through my rage like a blade. Tommy had thought this through, had planned for the possibility that I might eventually break and try to expose him. He had a counter-strategy ready, one that would not only discredit anything I might say but would also put me in an even more vulnerable position. And in the meantime, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, I'll make sure that everyone you care about pays the price for your disobedience. Starting with your precious sister Sarah. The mention of Sarah's name was like a bucket of ice water thrown over my rage. I stopped struggling, stopped shouting, stopped fighting entirely. Because I knew, with horrible certainty, that Tommy would do exactly what he threatened. He would find ways to hurt Sarah, to make her suffer. For my defiance, and it would be my fault. That's better, Tommy said, releasing my wrist and returning his attention to the dying bird in his other hand. I was hoping you'd see reason. Now, where were we in our lesson? I stood there in that kitchen, rubbing my bruised wrist and watching helplessly as Tommy finished what he'd started with the baby bird. But something fundamental had changed in that moment. The part of me that had still hoped for rescue, that had still believed someone might help me if I could just find the right words to explain what was happening, finally died along with that small, innocent creature. I was truly alone now, trapped. Not just by Tommy's threats but by the understanding that he held all the cards in this twisted game. He could hurt me with impunity, knowing that I wouldn't dare report him for fear of the consequences to myself and others. He could escalate his cruelty as much as he wanted, secure in the knowledge that his carefully constructed facade of normalcy would protect him from any serious scrutiny. That night, as I lay in my bed trying not to think about the image of that baby bird's suffering, I began to plan my own death. It seemed like the only escape left to me, the only way to end the nightmare that my life had become. I wasn't dramatic or emotional about it. By this point, I was too drained for high emotions. I simply began to consider the most practical ways to accomplish it, weighing the pros and cons of different methods like I was planning a school project. The irony wasn't lost on me that Tommy's campaign to establish control over me had worked exactly as he'd intended. I was as helpless and hopeless as those small animals he tortured, trapped in a situation where death seemed preferable to continued suffering. He had broken me systematically and methodically, and now I was ready to do his work for him. But fate, as it sometimes does, had other plans. The next morning brought news that would change everything, though I had no way of knowing it at the time. Sarah burst into our bedroom while I was still lying in bed, staring at the water stains on the ceiling and contemplating the quickest way to end my misery. Maggie, you'll never guess what happened, she said, her voice bright with excitement. Mrs. Henderson called this morning. Her daughter Janet is getting married next month, and she's offered me a job helping to plan the wedding. It's only for a few weeks, but the pay is really good, and I'll get to learn about the catering business. I turned to look at her, not understanding why this news should matter to me in my current state of despair. Sarah was always getting opportunities like this. She was the kind of person who attracted good fortune and interesting possibilities wherever she went. The best part is, Sarah continued, sitting down on the edge of my bed, she wants me to bring an assistant. Someone to help with the smaller tasks and learn the business alongside me. I immediately thought of you. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than fear or despair. A tiny spark of something that might have been hope stirred in my chest, though I was almost afraid to acknowledge it. You want me to help with the wedding? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Of course I do, Sarah said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair away from my face. We'd be working together every day for the next 3 weeks, helping to plan what's going to be the biggest wedding this town has seen in years. It would mean spending most of our time at the Henderson place, learning about flowers and decorations. And all that grown-up stuff. What do you say? What I wanted to say was yes, immediately and without reservation. 3 weeks away from Tommy, 3 weeks where I wouldn't have to watch my back every moment or wonder what new horror he was planning for me. It sounded like paradise, like a reprieve from a death sentence. But even as hope began to bloom in my chest, I could hear Tommy's voice in my head, promising consequences for any attempt to escape his control. He wouldn't like this development, wouldn't want me to have any freedom or independence that might allow me to gain strength or find allies. There would be a price to pay for accepting Sarah's offer, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face whatever retaliation he might devise. I don't know, I said finally, hating myself for the weakness in my voice. Maybe I should just stay home. Help Mom with the housework and stuff. Sarah frowned, clearly puzzled by my reluctance to jump at what should have been an exciting opportunity. Maggie, when's the last time you left this house for anything other than absolute necessity? You can't keep hiding away like this. It's not healthy. She was right, of course. I had become a prisoner in my own home, afraid to venture far from familiar territory where I could at least predict when and how Tommy might strike. But the thought of being away from the house, away from his immediate reach, was so appealing that it almost brought tears to my eyes. Think about it, Sarah said, standing up and smoothing down her skirt. Mrs. Henderson wants an answer by tomorrow, so you have time to decide. But Maggie, I really think this could be good for you. You need something to look forward to, something to get you out of whatever funk you've been in all summer. After she left the room, I lay there wrestling with the decision that could determine whether I lived or died. Because I understood, with absolute clarity, that this job offer represented more than just a temporary escape from Tommy's presence. It was a chance to remember who I used to be before he began his systematic destruction of my spirit. It was an opportunity to be around normal people doing normal things, to remember that the world contained more than just predators and prey. But it was also an act of defiance that Tommy would not tolerate, and I had no illusions about what that might cost me. The question was whether I had enough fight left in me to take the risk, or whether his campaign of terror had finally succeeded in breaking me completely. As I lay there weighing my options, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside our room. Slow, deliberate footsteps that I recognized immediately. Tommy was coming to check on me, perhaps to make sure that his demonstration with the baby bird had achieved its intended effect. The decision to accept Sarah's offer came to me that very evening as I sat in the bathroom, staring at the bottle of cleaning supplies under the sink and wondering if drinking them would be quick enough to escape Tommy's notice. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was contemplating using poison to escape someone who had been poisoning me, but desperation has a way of making even the most twisted logic seem reasonable. Sarah knocked softly on the bathroom door, interrupting my dark contemplation. Maggie? Mrs. Henderson needs an answer first thing tomorrow morning. Are you going to take the job? I looked at my reflection in the small mirror above the sink, and barely recognized the hollow-eyed, skeletal girl staring back at me. This wasn't living anymore, this was just existing in a state of constant terror, waiting for the next horror that Tommy would devise. At least if I took the job and he killed me for it, I would have had 3 weeks of freedom first. 3 weeks of remembering what it felt like to be human instead of prey. Yes, I called back through the door, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Tell Mrs. Henderson I'll do it. I heard Sarah's little squeal of excitement from the hallway, and for the first time in months, I felt something that might have been hope stirring weakly in my chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me put the cleaning supplies back under the sink and walk out of that bathroom with my head held slightly higher than it had been in weeks. The next morning, while Tommy was still asleep and our parents were getting ready for work, Sarah and I walked the 6 blocks to the Henderson house to meet with Mrs. Henderson about our new jobs. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the familiar sights and sounds of our neighborhood seemed almost foreign to me after months of rarely leaving our house. Mrs. Henderson was a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s who had lived in Millbrook her entire life and knew everyone's business better than they knew it themselves. Her house was one of the largest in town, a Victorian mansion with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch that spoke of old money and established respectability. She greeted us at the front door with a warm smile and ushered us into a parlor filled with antique furniture and the smell of fresh-baked cookies. Sarah, dear, you look lovely as always, Mrs. Henderson said, embracing my sister with genuine affection. Then she turned to me, and I saw her expression change slightly as she took in my appearance. And this must be Margaret. My goodness, child, you're as thin as a rail. Have you been ill? Before I could answer, Sarah jumped in with the explanation we had agreed upon during our walk. Maggie had a terrible stomach bug earlier this summer that really knocked her for a loop. She's still getting her strength back, but she's feeling much better now. Mrs. Henderson nodded sympathetically, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she continued to study my face. She was the kind of woman who had raised 5 children of her own and had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when something was wrong with a young person. Well, we'll have to make sure you get plenty of good food while you're working for me, she said finally. My cook makes the most wonderful chicken soup, and I believe in feeding my employees well. A good meal can cure a multitude of ills. The job itself was exactly what I needed: busy, engaging work that required my complete attention and left no room for dwelling on the horrors waiting for me at home. Mrs. Henderson's daughter Janet was marrying the son of a wealthy family from Columbus, and the wedding was to be the social event of the season. We would be responsible for helping with everything from addressing invitations to arranging flowers, from coordinating with caterers to ensuring that every detail of the reception was perfect. Mrs. Henderson explained that we would be working 6 days a week for the next 3 weeks, starting each morning at 8 and finishing around 5 in the evening. The pay was more than I had ever dreamed of earning, enough to buy new clothes and maybe even save a little for the future I was no longer sure I would have. There's just one thing, Mrs. Henderson said as she was showing us around the house and explaining our duties. I like to maintain a certain atmosphere of calm and efficiency in my home. I don't tolerate drama or upheaval of any kind. If you girls have any personal problems or family issues that might interfere with your work, I need to know about them now. Sarah assured her that we would be completely professional and dedicated to our duties, but I could feel Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes studying my face again. I had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see more than I wanted her to see, that my carefully constructed facade of normalcy wasn't quite as convincing as I'd hoped. That first day of work was like stepping into an alternate universe where beauty and elegance were the primary concerns, where the biggest crisis was whether the ivory roses would clash with the cream-colored tablecloths. I threw myself into the tasks with desperate intensity, grateful for anything that could distract me from the constant anxiety that had become my normal state of being. Sarah and I worked side by side, addressing hundreds of invitations in careful calligraphy, sorting through fabric samples for the bridesmaids' dresses, and learning about flower arrangements from the florist who came to consult with Mrs. Henderson about the reception decorations. It was mindless, peaceful work that allowed my jangled nerves to slowly begin to calm. But the real miracle was the food. Mrs. Henderson insisted that we join her for lunch every day, and her cook, a motherly woman named Mrs. Patterson, seemed to take personal offense at my skeletal appearance. She plied me with hearty soups, fresh bread, roasted chicken, and homemade pies, all while muttering under her breath about children who didn't eat enough and parents who didn't pay attention to their offspring's nutritional needs. For the first time in months, I found myself actually hungry, actually looking forward to meals instead of dreading them. Without the constant fear that my food might be contaminated, I began to remember what it felt like to take pleasure in eating. Slowly, gradually, my body began to respond to this regular nourishment, and I could feel some of my strength returning. But even as I began to physically recover, I was constantly aware that this reprieve was temporary. Every evening, Sarah and I would walk home together, and with each step closer to Maple Street, I could feel the familiar knot of dread forming in my stomach. Tommy would be there, waiting, watching, planning his next move in our twisted game. The first few evenings, he seemed content to simply observe my improved mood and gradually returning health with that calculating look I knew so well. He didn't say anything directly threatening, didn't make any overt moves against me, but I could feel his anger simmering just below the surface. He had worked so hard to break me down, and now I was showing signs of recovery that he couldn't allow to continue. It was on the Thursday of our first week that Tommy finally made his displeasure known. I had come home from work actually smiling for the first time in months, excited to tell our mother about the beautiful flower arrangements we had been working on, when I found him waiting for me in the hallway outside my bedroom. "You seem to be enjoying your little job," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "Making new friends, eating regular meals, getting your strength back. How nice for you." I tried to push past him to get to my room, but he shifted slightly to block my path, not obviously enough that anyone watching would think he was threatening me, but enough to make his message clear. "The thing is," he continued, still speaking in that conversational tone that chilled me to the bone, "I'm not sure I like this new development. You're getting ideas above your station, little sister. Starting to think you're better than your family, maybe? Starting to forget where you belong?" "I'm just working," I said quietly, my eyes fixed on the floor. "Sarah and I are just helping with a wedding." Tommy mused, as if considering this explanation. "But working where? With whom? Around people who don't know what you're really like, who might believe whatever stories you decide to tell them." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. He was warning me not to confide in Mrs. Henderson or anyone else at the wedding job, reminding me that he still held all the power in our relationship despite my temporary escape during the day. "I won't say anything," I whispered, hating myself for the promise even as I made it. Tommy smiled, but it was the cold, satisfied smile of a predator who has successfully established dominance over his prey. "I know you won't," he said. "Because you're a smart girl, and smart girls understand the consequences of their choices." He let me pass then, but I could feel his eyes on me as I hurried into my bedroom and closed the door behind me. Even there, in what should have been my sanctuary, I didn't feel safe. The walls seemed thin and insubstantial, offering no real protection from the monster who lived just down the hall. That night, I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling and trying to figure out how long I could maintain this delicate balance. The job was saving my life in more ways than one, giving me hope and strength and a reason to keep fighting. But it was also making Tommy more dangerous, more determined to reassert his control over me before I slipped completely out of his grasp. The second week brought new challenges and new threats. My improved appearance hadn't gone unnoticed by Mrs. Henderson, who made several comments about how much better I was looking and how pleased she was to see me recovering from my illness. But she also began asking more pointed questions about my home life, wondering aloud why a young girl would have gotten so run down in the first place. You know, dear, she said one afternoon as we were arranging white lilies in tall crystal vases, if you ever need someone to talk to about anything that might be troubling you, I hope you know that you can come to me. I've raised 5 children of my own, and I've seen just about everything that can happen in a family. The kindness in her voice almost brought tears to my eyes, and for a moment I was tempted to tell her everything. Mrs. Henderson was clearly a woman of influence and authority in our small town. If anyone could help me deal with Tommy, it would be someone like her. But even as the words began to form in my mouth, I could hear Tommy's voice in my head, reminding me of all the ways he could hurt not just me but everyone I cared about. Mrs. Henderson was kind and well-meaning, but she lived in a world where children were protected and monsters were obvious. She would never believe that an 11-year-old boy could be capable of the systematic cruelty that Tommy had shown me. Thank you, I said finally, focusing intently on the lilies in my hands. But everything's fine at home. Really? Mrs. Henderson didn't look convinced, but she didn't push the issue. Instead, she simply nodded and continued with her own flower arranging, though I could feel her watching me carefully for the rest of the afternoon. It was Sarah who finally pushed the situation to a crisis point. On Friday evening of our second week, she burst into our bedroom with an expression of barely contained fury that I had never seen on her face before. What did you do to your wrist? She demanded, grabbing my arm and pushing up the sleeve of my sweater to reveal the bruises that Tommy had left when he grabbed me during our confrontation over the baby bird. I had been careful to keep the bruises covered, wearing long sleeves even in the hot August weather, but the marks had faded to a greenish yellow that made them more visible than when they were fresh. Sarah stared at the finger-shaped marks with growing horror, and I could see the pieces falling into place in her mind. These are from someone grabbing you, she said, her voice tight with anger. Someone with bigger hands than yours. Someone stronger than you. I pulled my arm away from her grasp and tugged my sleeve back down, but it was too late. Sarah had seen what she needed to see, and I could tell from her expression that she wasn't going to let this go. It's nothing, I said weakly. I just bumped into something. Don't lie to me, Margaret Rose Patterson, Sarah said, using my full name the way our mother did when she was particularly upset about something. You don't get bruises like that from bumping into furniture. Someone hurt you, and I want to know who. For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. Sarah was older, stronger, more confident than I was. Maybe she could help me figure out how to deal with Tommy, maybe. She could protect me the way I couldn't protect myself. But before I could open my mouth to try to explain, we heard footsteps in the hallway outside our room. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that could only belong to one person. Tommy was coming, drawn by the sound of our raised voices, ready to insert himself into any conversation that might threaten his carefully maintained control over our family dynamic. Promise me you won't say anything, I whispered urgently to Sarah. Please, just promise me you'll let this go. Sarah looked confused and frustrated, but before she could respond, Tommy appeared in our doorway with that familiar false smile plastered across his face. What's all the excitement about? He asked, his tone light and interested. I could hear you girls talking all the way from my room. Sarah looked between Tommy and me, and I could see suspicion beginning to dawn in her eyes. She was smart. My sister, and she was finally starting to put together the pieces of a puzzle that had been right in front of her for months. Just girl talk, she said finally, but her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Nothing that would interest you. Tommy's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. Oh, but I'm interested in everything that concerns our family, he said. We shouldn't keep secrets from each other, should we? After all, we're all in this together now. The way he said those words, we're all in this together, made my blood run cold. It sounded like a threat, a reminder that he considered Sarah as much a potential target as he did me. I could see that Sarah sensed something wrong in his tone too, because she took a small step closer to me, positioning herself between Tommy and where I sat on my bed. Some things are private, Sarah said, echoing the same words she had used weeks earlier when Tommy had interrupted another of our conversations. Family doesn't mean no boundaries. Tommy's expression darkened slightly, and for a moment his mask of false friendliness slipped enough to reveal the calculating predator underneath. Boundaries, he repeated, as if tasting the word. Interesting concept. But you know what I think, Sarah? I think boundaries are just another word for secrets. And secrets have a way of causing problems in families. The threat was veiled but unmistakable, and I could see that Sarah finally understood what I had been dealing with all these months. Her face went pale, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she held her ground. Get out of our room, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. Now. For a moment, Tommy looked like he might refuse, might push the confrontation to its logical conclusion right there in our bedroom. But then we heard our mother's voice calling from downstairs, asking if we were ready for dinner, and the spell was broken. Of course, Tommy said, his false smile returning as quickly as it had disappeared. I didn't mean to intrude on your private conversation. But remember what I said about secrets, girls. They have a way of coming back to bite you when you least expect it. After he left, Sarah and I sat in silence for several long minutes, both of us trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Sarah turned to me with an expression of grim determination that reminded me of our mother when she had made up her mind about something important. We need to talk, she said. Really talk, not this dancing around the truth that we've been doing. And we need to do it somewhere he can't hear us. That night, after our parents had gone to bed and the house had settled into its familiar creaking quiet, Sarah and I snuck out of our room and made our way to the old tree house that our father had built in the backyard before he died. It hadn't been used in years, and the wooden boards were weathered and slightly loose, but it was far enough from the house that we could speak freely without fear of being overheard. Under the light of a flashlight that Sarah had borrowed from Robert's toolbox, I finally told my sister everything. I told her about the poisoned chocolate milk and the threats that followed, about the basement confrontation and the torture of small animals, about the constant fear that had become my daily reality. I showed her the bruises on my wrist and explained how I had gotten them, and I watched her face go through a series of emotions: shock, horror, fury, and finally a cold determination that made her look older and harder than her 16 years. When I finished my story, Sarah sat in silence for a long time, staring out through the small window of the treehouse at our darkened home. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but filled with a strength I had never heard from her before. "We're going to stop him," she said simply. "I don't know how yet, but we're going to find a way to stop him before he hurts you again." For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in my fight against the monster who shared our home. Sarah believed me, Sarah was on my side, and together we might actually have a chance of surviving Tommy's reign of terror. But even as hope began to bloom in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that our confrontation in the bedroom had changed something fundamental in Tommy's approach to our family. He knew now that Sarah was becoming suspicious, that his carefully maintained facade was beginning to crack. And I had learned enough about him over the past months to know that he wouldn't take this threat to his control lying down. The war was about to escalate, and I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for what Tommy might do when he felt truly cornered. The plan Sarah devised was brilliantly simple in its execution but required nerves of steel to pull off. We would use Tommy's own methods against him, turning his confidence in his psychological manipulation into a trap that would finally expose him to our parents in a way he couldn't explain away or deflect. "He thinks he's smarter than everyone else," Sarah whispered as we huddled together in the treehouse that night. "He's gotten so comfortable with his games that he's stopped being careful. We're going to make him overconfident, make him think he's won completely, and then we're going to catch him in the act." The third week of our job at Mrs. Henderson's would be crucial. Sarah had convinced our employer to let us work late one evening to finish the final preparations for the wedding, which meant we wouldn't be home until after dark. This would give Tommy the impression that he had unlimited access to our room and our belongings, that he could escalate his psychological warfare without fear of interruption. What he wouldn't know was that Sarah had borrowed a small camera from one of her friends at school, a girl whose father was a photographer and had access to equipment that could take pictures in low-light conditions. We would hide the camera in our bedroom, positioned to capture whatever Tommy might do when he thought he was unobserved. The waiting was almost unbearable. During that final week, I had to pretend that I was growing increasingly desperate and defeated, that the temporary respite of the job was ending and I was sinking back into the hopeless despair that Tommy had worked so hard to cultivate. I stopped eating as much at Mrs. Henderson's house, let my shoulders slump with renewed defeat, and made sure that Tommy could see the fear returning to my eyes whenever he looked at me. He responded exactly as Sarah had predicted he would. His confidence grew with each passing day as he watched me apparently reverting to the broken, terrified girl he had spent months creating. He began making increasingly bold threats, no longer bothering to disguise his pleasure at my apparent helplessness. "Enjoying your last few days of freedom?" he asked one morning as I was getting ready for work. "Because after this week, things are going to be different around here. Very different." On Thursday evening, the night we had chosen for our trap, Sarah and I set up the camera carefully in our bedroom, concealing it among some books on our shared dresser where it would have a clear view of the entire room. Then we left for Mrs. Henderson's house, making sure that Tommy saw us go and heard us discussing how late we would be working. Mrs. Henderson had graciously agreed to let us stay for dinner after we finished our work, which gave us a legitimate reason to be away from home until well after 9 o'clock. By the time we returned, walking slowly up Maple Street in the gathering darkness, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure Sarah could hear it. The house was quiet when we let ourselves in through the front door. Our parents were in the living room watching television, and we called out normal greetings as we headed upstairs to our room. Tommy was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear music playing softly from behind his closed bedroom door. Sarah retrieved the camera with hands that trembled only slightly, and we waited until we were sure everyone was asleep before developing the film in the makeshift darkroom that Sarah had set up in our basement laundry room. She had learned the basics of photography from the same friend who had lent us the camera, and though our setup was crude, it was sufficient for our purposes. What we saw when the images finally appeared in the developer solution was even worse than we had expected. Tommy had spent hours in our room, going through our belongings with the methodical thoroughness of someone conducting a search. But it was what he had done to my bed that made my stomach turn and filled Sarah with a rage so cold it was frightening to witness. He had arranged my pillow and blankets to create the outline of a human form, and then had spent time positioning himself over this makeshift figure in ways that left no doubt about his intentions. The camera had captured everything, his face clearly visible, his actions unmistakable, his complete absorption in his twisted fantasy. But perhaps most damning of all was the final image on the roll of film. Tommy had taken one of my nightgowns from the dresser drawer and had done things to it that I cannot bring myself to describe even now, decades later. The photograph showed him holding the ruined garment with an expression of such satisfied cruelty that it made me feel sick just looking at it. "This ends tomorrow," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with a determination that brooked no argument. "We're showing these to Mom and Robert first thing in the morning, and then we're calling the police." I wanted to agree with her, wanted to feel the same sense of impending justice that I could see in her eyes. But months of psychological torture had left their mark, and I found myself still afraid of what Tommy might do when he was finally cornered. "What if they don't believe us?" I whispered. "What if he convinces them that we staged the pictures somehow?" Sarah held up one of the photographs, studying Tommy's face in the dim red light of our improvised darkroom. "Look at him, Maggie. Really look at him. This isn't the face of a normal child playing a prank or acting out some innocent fantasy. This is the face of someone who enjoys causing pain, someone who gets pleasure from the thought of hurting you. No one who sees these pictures will be able to explain them away." The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent rain that seemed to mirror the somber mood that had settled over our house. Sarah and I waited until Tommy had left for school before approaching our parents with the photographs. We found them in the kitchen, sharing their morning coffee and discussing the mundane details of their respective workdays. "Mom, Robert," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled, "we need to show you something. It's about Tommy." I watched our parents' faces change as they looked at the photographs, saw the progression from confusion to disbelief to horror to rage. Robert's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor, but he didn't seem to notice. Our mother's face went completely white, and she had to grip the edge of the kitchen table to keep from falling. "Where did you get these?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah explained about the camera, about our suspicions and our plan to catch Tommy in the act. She told them about the bruises on my wrist, about my weight loss and my obvious terror whenever Tommy was around. She spoke calmly and logically, presenting the evidence like a prosecutor building a case. But it was our mother who asked the question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Maggie," she said, tears streaming down her face, "how long has this been going on? How long has he been hurting you?" And so I told them everything. The poisoning, the threats, the systematic psychological torture that had nearly driven me to suicide. I told them about the small animals he had killed, about the constant fear that had become my normal state of existence, about the way he had turned our home into a prison where I was always the victim and he was always the predator. When I finished, the kitchen was silent except for the sound of the rain against the windows and our mother's quiet sobbing. Robert sat frozen in his chair, staring at the photographs spread across the table as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "He's my son," he said finally, his voice breaking. "How could I not have seen this? How could I have brought this monster into your home?" But our mother was already reaching for the telephone. "We're calling the police," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Right now. Today. This ends today." The police arrived within an hour, 2 officers who listened to our story with professional calm and examined the photographs with the kind of clinical detachment that somehow made Tommy's crime seem even more real and horrible. They asked detailed questions, took careful notes, and assured us that what Tommy had done constituted multiple serious offenses that would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Tommy was arrested at school that afternoon, taken into custody in front of his classmates and teachers. The news spread through our small town like wildfire, and by evening, everyone in Millbrook knew that the quiet boy from Maple Street had been hiding a secret so dark that it shocked even the most worldly residents. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. The photographs provided undeniable evidence of Tommy's intentions, and when investigators searched his room, they found a collection of disturbing drawings and writings that painted a picture of a deeply troubled child whose fantasies were escalating toward actual violence. The judge who heard the case was a stern woman who had seen enough child predators to recognize the signs of someone who would only become more dangerous as he grew older. She sentenced Tommy to a juvenile detention facility with mandatory psychological treatment, with the possibility of transfer to an adult prison if he showed no signs of improvement by his 18th birthday. Robert moved out of our house the day after Tommy's sentencing, unable to bear the guilt of what his son had put our family through. He left us money to cover the mortgage and other expenses, but we all understood that his marriage to our mother was over. Some wounds are too deep to heal, some betrayals too fundamental to forgive. In the months that followed, I slowly began to rebuild my life with the help of a kind therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. The nightmares faded gradually, and my appetite returned as I learned to trust food again. I finished school, went to college, and eventually became a teacher myself, drawn to work with children who needed protection and understanding. Sarah and I remained close throughout our lives, bound together by the shared experience of surviving a monster and finding the courage to fight back. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate herself to social work with abused children, and I often wondered if our experience with Tommy had shaped that choice. I did marry eventually, to a gentleman named David who understood that some stories are too painful to tell and some scars too deep to completely heal. We had a good life together, filled with small joys and quiet contentments, and when he passed away 3 years ago, I felt grateful for every peaceful day we had shared. Tommy died in prison at the age of 28, killed in a fight with another inmate who discovered what he had been incarcerated for. I felt no joy at the news, only a quiet sense of closure and the knowledge that he would never hurt another child the way he had hurt me. Now, at 71, I look back on that terrible summer of 1967 and marvel at the resilience of the human spirit. What Tommy tried to destroy in me, my capacity for trust, for hope, for love, ultimately survived his worst efforts. I learned that even the darkest evil cannot completely extinguish the light in a human soul, especially when that soul finds the courage to fight back. To any young person who might be listening to this story and recognizing something familiar in their own life, I want you to know this: you are not alone, you are not powerless, and you deserve to be protected. Find someone you trust, a teacher, a counselor, a friend's parent, and tell them what is happening to you. It takes tremendous courage to speak up, but your voice has power, and there are people who will believe you and help you. The monsters that masquerade as family members, as trusted figures, as ordinary people are real. But so is your strength, so is your worth, and so is the possibility of a life beyond their reach. You are more resilient than you know, braver than you believe, and worthy of a future filled with safety and love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.